thank you for joining us today. We'll be talking about AI, blockchain, data privacy, and how all of these new technologies are affecting the law. My name is Louise Houghton. I'm a broadcast journalist, having done many panel discussions on science, technology, and the digital world. And I'm very excited to have our panel with us this afternoon. Lots of experts in their own fields. From my right here, I have Antíoco Cuesta. He is the CEO and co-founder of Improove. To my left, Michael Schwarz, who is also the other co-founder of Improove. And then I have three lawyers joining us today. We have, to my right, ladies first, Jannika, a Finnish lawyer based in Stockholm, who specializes in data privacy and data protection. Koonce, who is based here in the US, a partner at Klaris Law, specializing in media and IP. And then in the end, Michael James-Clifton, a barrister whose role is to advise Judge Bernd Hammermann at the EFTA court in Luxembourg. Thank you to you all for joining us this afternoon. We're experiencing a new wave of technological advancements at this moment, so I know that this is going to be a really interesting discussion this afternoon, talking about how it's really a double-edged sword. For example, the introduction of AI could be seen as really beneficial and help with productivity and management in the home and in the workplace. But then on the flip side of that, we're seeing AI developing toxic molecules. We're also seeing it create killer robots going out to the battlefield. And so we're really questioning what that means for civilization. If we look at blockchain, we can see its benefits for companies to track data and keep record of every single bit of information entered into the systems. But how secure are these networks? We're really hearing about scams and fraud involving cryptocurrencies. So should we trust this technology? Isn't trusting this technology especially a problem if we expect it to be the underlying infrastructure of Web3? Which takes us, of course, onto the topic of data protection and the question of security for us leading our daily lives within this digital world. So much to get through in the next hour and a half. But let's start by taking a step back in time, going back 50, 60 years to the 60s and 70s, when we couldn't even imagine holding a phone in our hands 24/7, let alone talking on FaceTime to family across the other side of the world, or having a robot drive our car for us. Do you think that there was a certain area of bliss to that particular time? Was there less stress on the body? Michael James, do you want to start?
Thank you, Louise. Well, I think it's quite easy to think about a time before an always connected life, by which I mean being immediately contactable by phone, text, email, or other messaging services, that everything was milk and honey. But we have to remember that during the transistor and the nuclear age, the Cold War was causing a lot of other strains on the public. But perhaps whilst not the general public couldn't conceive the future of a connected, always connected life, there were quite a lot of sci-fi writers who were quite prescient in envisaging the future. And I would think of George Orwell in his seminal work, 1984, who foresaw the idea of artificial intelligence both creating music and also the songs to go with them. And so whilst the public was perhaps a little bit more blissful about these technological matters, some people were thinking about it.
Yes, well, they're always happening in the background before they actually come out into public knowledge, aren't they? What about data security and data breaches? Did we need to worry about that, Jannika? Because everything was kind of handwritten back in those days, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fairly safe to say that the problems that we're facing now were not issues back then, because that kind of technology did not exist. However, I think it also serves as a good reminder that new technology brings along new kinds of problems. So for instance, we did not need to have any kind of protection against arbitrary telephone tapping until the telephone came on. We did not need to know the notions of data privacy and information privacy until data collection was made very sophisticated and searchable in ways that paper files and so on did not allow for. Again, same way, we did not need to have a right to be forgotten until the internet came along, and now at this very moment we don't really see a need to have a right to the integrity of our own minds and thoughts, but that might not be the case in the future.
Well, it's all just happened so rapidly, I think, hasn't it? They say that the digital revolution, has happened so much quicker than any of the other ones in the past. And so I wonder how that is for us as humans. How are we always keeping up with things? I mean, baby boomers and Gen X, for example, they grew up without any of this technology. And so, how easy has it been to adapt to this kind of technology? What would you say, Lars?
No, I find that question's very interesting, and I think we're going to be asking these questions about sort of where do humans fit with technology, and we talked about some of this before the panel, and I think that's going to be a very interesting question. Humans live 70, 80 years, and you learn the things you learn, and they sort of get baked in when you're young, and how do you then adapt when the technology in the world is changing so fast as you get older? I think some people have more I have an 85-year mother who's better at texting and using emojis than I am, but I have, contemporaries who still print out emails instead of reading them on the screen. So, when I was growing up, the media technology was 8-track cassettes to Sony Walkman over the course of a decade, and now in the past 10 years, you have such explosive change in that world. And when Meta created the Threads app a few weeks ago and launched it, they had 95 million subscribers in hours. And then, of course, the next week their user numbers plummeted. So it's that kind of change that's hard to keep up with, I think, for us we think in maybe a slightly longer time frame, and the technology moves faster.
Yeah, they say scientifically that our bodies don't like change, that actually our bodies react to change as they would a threat, and so it goes into a fight or flight mode, and that's how the brain responds to it. So I do worry about this stress on all the bodies. I know, Michael, you were saying when you had to incorporate AI into Improve that it was quite a challenge for you.
Not necessarily a challenge, but it was like what you just said, like change is tough, right? And we've built the company for 14 years with our processes and like our products and like things that are running really well. I think, now it's done, and then suddenly, you're certainly used with Google to have a lot of change. Google does 900 changes a year, so we're used to change. But that change that happened and the pace of it is just so fast. And okay, do I really want to change everything that we do? Like change our established processes and so on and so forth. So you really have to do that right now. And so it's uncomfortable for sure. But there's also opportunity in that because that gives first move advantage, and there's good sides to it. But initially there's some sort of cycle of a cycle of acceptance, right? So the first there's fear, and then there is anger, and then there is I don't want this, and at some point you accept, okay, that actually happened. That's going to happen. And the sooner you get to the stage of acceptance, saying, okay, this is happening, then you can move on and deal with it. And I think we are arrived at that point, but I will tell you when we saw how this is changing our industry, I personally was a little shocked, and I talked to my peers even outside the company, and they're also not happy with it. But then once you get to the point of acceptance, think, okay, there's opportunity in this as well.
And it takes time to get to learn something, even though in the long run it might save you time. It's investing that time in the first place. That's really hard. But so the audience understand a little bit more. Antti, can you tell us a little bit more about what Improve actually does for its customers?
Yeah. Basically, we are an international company, digital. We are based in Spain, Austria, Germany, and the US here in New York. And we do two things. Basically, we make clients or companies more profitable. We raise the turnover, and we also do online reputation for brands, for companies, and for celebrities to clean up when there are fake news about people or about companies. We help them to improve the brand.
Fantastic. And would you say that this incorporation of AI has actually benefited Improve, Michael?
I mean, yes, I have to say, after all, I think on two fronts. First of all, after I accepted the change, I think it's great to go out to clients and actually provide solutions. And there's this pivotal moments when a lot of things change, where there's opportunity for clients to just go ahead of everyone who does not do it. So that hasn't been an opportunity. And I think also internally for us, we've started adopting it, and we are by far not as far as we could be, but there's one core process that we do that took us like 30 to 40 minutes to do, and now it takes us 5 minutes, and the result is 10 times better. And it kind of makes sense. There's so many data points that like a human can consume, and the competitor analysis is like 3 or 4 competitors that you look at, and now AI can look at 10, and like you would look at 3 or 4 data points. Now we can look at hundreds if we wanted to. So you can always argue, is that kind of data necessary? But in our case, you could really see that the results and the end result also for our clients is much better with it. Still in the early days of it, and there's way more to come, and a lot of question marks. But so far, it's been good for us.
And of course, we're talking about AI here, which is the talk of the town, but there's a lot of talk nowadays more about generative AI, which is very different from AI. And artificial intelligence has actually been around a long time. Google have been using it for many years, haven't they?
Yes, Google has always used it. I mean, I worked for Google for many years. We've used it back then. And they're just bringing more and more of it to the forefront. Obviously, it's developing. And they are not nearly releasing as much as they could because they want to be very careful too on the impact of it. There's also a lot of criticism of Google and of how they use it. But yes, like if you use Google today, you already used AI. So that's how the search engine works. And so yes, it's not necessarily breaking news that they're using it. I think the breaking news is how fast it's developing and what are additional functionalities that come up.
Well, about different functionalities, talk a bit more about the SGE then.
No, sure. So SGE, it's probably, so they released a totally new experience of Google that's probably none of you have seen yet. It's only like in a testing phase. It's going to launch later this year for a wider public, and it's a totally new Google. So if look at search results, it's just totally different. And the reason they're doing that is that, in my entire career, I've worked with Google and for Google in all capacities, and for 20 years I could say Google has the best search results there is. There's no better way of finding information than through Google. And that was not true anymore with ChatGPT. There are instances where Google, like ChatGPT, delivers better results than Google, especially for very specific information. So I have a house on Long Island, and I wanted to see, okay, what vegetables can I plant in partial shade in the month of May in eastern Long Island, right? And that's information that I wouldn't find on Google. They would give me information what I can plant in New York State, which maybe Albany, maybe it's not relevant for eastern Long Island. So and ChatGPT gave me an answer instantaneously, and that's amazing. So the answer of ChatGPT was just better. You can always argue it's not 100% correct, but neither is Google, right? So you always have to validate your information. And that's a threat for Google if there's another service out there that provides better information. So they had to do something about it. And SGE that's the new experience, new Google, is doing that. And once you get a chance to look at it, it looks nothing like we used to, but if you give it a try, it's actually better. So.
Yeah, and you mentioned, Google would do that. You put something in there and it would bring up a load of things that are not relevant, not factually correct, or not on your location or something like that. And I know that Improove actually sort of helps your clients and your customers sort of land on that first page when you're in Google. Mm-hmm. That's a lot to do with what you're talking about with your client's online reputation. So how important would you say that it is for customers to maintain that online reputation and for individuals as well?
I think it's very important for celebrities and for companies. At the end, it's gotta be in the communication department of every company. They have to be on a reputation management team or belong to them, because we know many cases of famous companies that they drop the money, the clients, thanks to online reputation. So I think it's very important. Yeah.
You mentioned celebrities there, and I always think that one's a little bit scary because there's so many different websites that you can go on and find a celebrity's address, whether you know it's correct or not. I'm sure are people out there that will go and check it out and research it. So I kind of wonder, coming to talking about law, is there a certain law that's in place that can help protect that kind of data being leaked? Maybe Michael James, back to you.
Yes, so I'll speak about the relevant law in the European Union and in the European Economic Area. And despite Brexit, the rules in the UK are essentially the same on this. So this is data protection law that we have in Europe, and there's a tremendous amount of legislation and case law on it, and I would talk for a long, long time if I were to go into particular detail. But there are a couple of bits that I would highlight. So the data protection legislation started in the mid-1990s with the directive, so that's a law that each country has to implement itself. And there was a case called Google Spain in 2014, which introduced the idea that a data subject, i.e. an ordinary person who's had their data used for a purpose, could have Google, in that case, forget, i.e. delete their entry in their search database if there was on the basis of a comparison of fundamental rights and the age of the information. And that was quite dramatic at the time. And then a couple of years later, the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU was introduced, and this is tremendously specialized legislation, and I mean, it's created an entire industry of data protection professionals. And, well, without going into specifics about it, really, because it's too detailed for this, but it affects all companies within the EEA and any company, rather, that has data dealings with Europe. So it has tremendous effect across the globe. And the companies have to fulfill certain principles when they're dealing with data, but there's someone much better placed to talk about this on the panel than I am. But there is a lot on this.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that in a little bit more detail. It's great to see that Europe are actually taking a way forward with this kind of information and actually protecting these things. How do you feel that different countries are handling it, Jannika?
Well, again, I have to also say that I know that the legislation of the EU and EEA, so the General Data Protection Regulation, and I'm guessing from that angle. But generally, I think I saw statistics from the UN stating that 70% of the whole world has some kind of data protection legislation in place. However, what I have found to be true is not necessarily only about having data protection regulations in place, but also ensuring that they can be enforced, and also not having other kinds of legal frameworks that undermine this kind of legislations. So.
Thank you. What about the US, Lance? Because I moved from the UK and Germany to the US, and I've had fraud happen 3 times since I've lived here in the last 6 years, and that never happened to me in my life. So would you say that there's less security here? Would you?
So obviously there's not less access to good technology to allow for better security in the U.S. I think it's more of it's a question of the legal regime here in the first instance, and maybe there's a cultural component as well. But in terms of legal regimes, we have a less strict set of privacy laws in the U.S. They are coming along. California in particular has been at the forefront of that. We're still nowhere close to what the GDPR looks like. And I think when laws and regulations lag behind that way, then the implementation of security measures and all of those things lag behind. And there is this cultural component in the U.S. where we think of ourselves as, as personal freedom being a number one, number one in importance. But when you have that push of people pushing back against any kind of restrictive legal regime, that also leads to a little more lawlessness on the other side. So I think that's what you see here. And then in terms of the fraud you're talking about, just specifically, in the U.S. there was a long stalemate between the banks and the retailers around chip and pin implementation, basically around who pays for fraud, because in the U.S. for years and years, the consumer almost never paid if there was fraud on a card use. So it just came down to who was going to pay, and so we are decades behind the rest of the world on chip and pin.
Yeah, I was writing checks for my rent when I first moved here, and I don't think...
And still, you still use the stripe on the back of the card instead of a chip, yep.
Yeah, I don't think teenagers in the UK know what checks are. So it's very interesting. But you know, we talk about fraud and everything. People sort of think that America has a very bad rep for crime, but actually some recent statistics I was looking up showed that Sweden actually ranked higher for their crime rate index than the US, only slightly, but that was very surprising to me. And that kind of brings me back to what you were saying about online reputation and how the internet really has an impact on our opinion of different things, I would say. So is there another example that you want to give us in terms of the brand reputation online and how something going viral has really affected them?
There's one, the famous one, I think one of the famous ones is Samsung, when they have the Samsung Note that exploded in the planes and everybody was scared and so on. It was only one model of Samsung, but Samsung dropped a lot in sales because nobody wants to buy a Samsung, and it was only one. So yeah, and there are a lot of examples like Nestle or Orange in Europe. There is a telco in Europe, very big also. Like, you need to be very, very careful with these kind of messages or kind of fake news also.
Yeah, fake news, actually, that's a whole other topic as well. And, I kind of wonder then, can the government or the law stop these kind of things being read? I was hearing recently about this scientist who, as an experiment for a lecture, actually decided to use his AI to see whether he could create this toxic molecule. And just by a slight alteration, he managed to create a whole load of deadly molecules which were worse than anything they'd ever seen before. And they decided to release a paper to warn people that this was a possibility. But on the flip side, sort of knowing that somebody could get a crazy idea and actually take and implement this because it was so simple to do. So my question then becomes, is there not a way to stop the public from reading that once the government finds out that this information is out there? That question goes to any of the lawyers in the table.
I mean, go ahead.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Or the question was if it's possible to stop the public from knowing.
Yeah, once it's already out there on the web.
Yeah.
I mean, in the U.S. at least, our freedom of speech is so ingrained in the law and it's used on both sides of the political spectrum to justify being able to speak about many, many topics. I mean, I do quite a bit of defamation law defense, but because of that, it's very, very difficult to get any kind of restraints, and do we want them, on the media in particular. And so it tends to come down to things that are the equivalent of yelling fire in a building that's not on fire. I mean, things that are threats. So something like a toxic molecule, I think that there could be a situation where something is so dangerous that at that point, maybe the government can step in and do something, but it's very difficult to do it from a sort of general regulatory or legal way. And of course, the biggest thing is that once the cat's out of the bag, it's almost impossible to get it back anyway.
Yeah.
So.
I was just going to say that. Yeah.
Everybody else starts writing and it just sort of spreads.
Yeah.
What about other issues that you've come across then, Lance, as a lawyer, with the introduction of AI? Do you want to talk a bit more about IP that you specialize in?
Sure. So that's my main area of expertise is intellectual property. And the question of AI's impact on IP has been coming up a lot recently. There have been a number of cases filed, in particular in the US in the past few months, starting around the beginning of the year, that ask the question of, when you take human creativity, and so, 100, 200 years of novels or plays or film or TV, and you feed that into an AI to ingest and then dissect and figure out what to do with it, and then you get output on the other side from the AI at the prompt of a user, that is it new? Is it something that's based on what came before? I mean, it's always based in all of what we do creatively is based on what we've done, people have done before. You're always, if you're a musician, you're referencing Stevie Wonder or the Beatles or in some way, and the copyright law in particular in the US and in most countries has to figure out where the line is between just pure plagiarism where you're free writing on something that someone's already done, and when you cross the line to something that's new and unique, that's a product of your own imagination. And this just gets super complicated with AI because AI is ingesting probably much more than a human can, and if it's done right, the output should be very different from all the things that were put into it. But the lawsuits right now are from artists and photographers and writers, all of whom are first arguing that just copying all their content in the first place to train the AI is a copyright violation, and that in some cases the output looks very, very similar to something that some artist put in to begin with, or some author. So this is going to keep coming up. It's going to be, and as AI gets more sophisticated, it's going to become even harder.
Well, you mentioned just now about writers, and of course here in the US we have a big writers' strike and actors' strike going on with the unions right now, and that's all because of AI and their contracts not really honoring their personal work.
It's a little different for actors and writers, but it's at the base of it, it's the same. It's that, for actors in particular, the concern is that a studio or a television company is going to take their performance, digitize it, and then say, we're just going to use this digitized performance going forward and put you in the background and pay you little or nothing. For writers, I think it's more of a, maybe more of a complete replacement threat, that the concern is that the studios won't even use writers, they'll use AI, and yet the AI is being fed on all the work of all these other writers. So they have hit, the sticking points have been around AI, and I think some of it's also because as we move to Web3 and immersive environments, the use of digitally created people, avatars, recreations, is just going to keep accelerating. So,
you just mentioned Web3. I'd love for you to just explain what that term means,
Sure.
just briefly.
So very briefly, so Web3 is essentially the next version of the World Wide Web, but built on decentralized platforms instead of the centralized infrastructure we have now. So blockchain would play a major role in it, and it would essentially be, the theory is that it would be a more democratic, community-owned infrastructure for the web.
Where we've got ChatGPT, giving us the search engines like Michael mentioned before, giving us and telling us what plants we need on our balcony on Long Island, right?
Right.
Do you think that ChatGPT could actually benefit you when you're talking about brand reputation?
In part or in somehow yes, because it can help you, to write some content, but at the end you need a human to, you are a generalist, so you can know, that a machine cannot never replace you, but can help you in order to give you more, a text that you need to review.
Yeah.
But of course, the people that review test, maybe they will be gone sometime.
Well, we'll get on to unemployment in just a minute.
Yeah.
But first of all, let's just talk a little bit about the marketing strategies and how all of this new technology is going to actually affect those.
I mean, I can speak for Google and or for what we do, and I mean, so Google is changing so much that there's definitely new tactics that we have to employ. I think the good thing is that it's more e-commerce and direct sales directed. So I mean, the way Google is changing is we used to search for something and then click on the website and see something and read it and then make a decision. And now for a lot of queries, Google is directly giving us the answer in the search results. So we don't even have to leave the google.com. And that's great as a user because you find all the information you want right there. It's not so great for a business because publishers make money by people going to their website and seeing advertisements. That's not happening, problem. It's like if you want to sell something and people are not coming to your site, also problem. So those are things that may be better for the consumer because they directly get information, but not necessarily better for businesses. But there are ways in order to take advantage of it. And Google understands eventually people want to do something, so they want to buy a product. So e-commerce is being promoted in the algorithm that if you search for an e-bike, they send you to a place where you can buy an e-bike. There's also a place for editorial, but you have to be very specific. While in the past you would write an article, what's the best e-bike, and then you send user to a site, Google answers that. But if you now you have to be more specific and have an article about what's the best e-bike for a hilly work commute of 10 miles. And that's something that Google can't answer in their AI, and then to send you to your website. Video is becoming way more important because people don't want to read. They enjoy seeing videos, and there's opportunities in this. So I would say video, very specific articles, and the third is tactics where people can actually do something.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. Continuing talking about ChatGPT, then I want to come to you, Jannika, and just ask you really a bit more about the data protection issue around it. Because if ChatGPT can imitate your voice, how does that really impact voice recognition authentication, for example?
Yeah. When we're talking about authentication, it's usually traditionally divided into 4 categories. We have the category of something that you know, such as a password. We have the category of something that you have, usually a device, then where you are, location, such as an office building, and then the 4th one that we're talking about here is what you are, that is usually biometrics of different kinds. Voice recognition, fingerprints, and all of those great things. So when we're talking about 2-factor authentication, to make authentication done in a robust way, so to speak, you usually pick something from 2 categories to make 2-factor authentication. Now, when we're talking about this last category, the category of what you are, the biometrics of yourself, that is the kind of information that is, you really want to use that because that is obviously the person you want to authenticate.
Talking
that
about
is there.
face recognition or fingerprints.
Exactly. It's very much tied to that person. However, we do need to remember that this is the kind of information that you cannot really change that easily about you. You cannot really change your fingerprints or face and voice and so on. And when compromised, that becomes then an issue. So then what I would argue is that we really need to think about how we use this kind of information, because this is information that becomes more and more readily available, and it's easy to obtain information about somebody's voice and some facial recognitions, all the pictures that we share on social media and so on. There is all this material out there. So how wise is it really to be used for authentication? Yeah.
So it's a question that is still out there.
Like there, and yeah.
Do you think that you're constantly chasing this technology? I mean, how easy is it to implement a law when you get a red flag like this and you see this technology come up?
Yeah, I think that is something that all the legislators in the world are struggling with, I suppose, because I'm gonna cite the ice hockey player Wayne Gretzky, I think he's called, because he said that he doesn't skate where the puck has been, he skates where it's going to be. And I think more and more legislators will look into the future and be able to predict not only where are we going, but the steps after that and the steps after that and steps after that, in order to for us to have legislation that is not always changed, and therefore to have some kind of legal security around like the predictability of law and so on. But it's a struggle, I think. Yeah.
I mean, you just said about people kind of coming on and having to, chase and look at the future and predict all of these things. That to me kind of, if I'm thinking about employment, says, oh, more jobs, more opportunities, that's great. But on the flip side, I kind of think of all of this AI is actually making a lot of people redundant and not needed anymore in the same way. Now, everybody, I think, in some ways, again, maybe because of online reputation, thinks that AI is going to actually create more unemployment, but actually they're wrong, aren't they?
I mean, we'll find out, I guess. But I mean, there's a study from the World Economic Forum that says that while I think 87 million jobs are being made redundant because of AI, there's 95 million jobs being created, or new roles being created. Granted, that may not be the exact same skill set, but there's new opportunity there. And I think, like the automotive industry went through something similar before, and they figured out at some point, like, building cars or putting the parts together is better done by a machine than by a person. But people are still being hired to control those machines, QA those machines, and monitor them because they're not always right. So I think for like a production line, they have like 35 people for a production line to oversee that versus like 35 workers before. So it's it's not a one-to-one replacement necessarily, but you need to monitor that and you need to be on top of that and steer the machine in the right direction. It's kind of like I guess when they came up with the calculator, math didn't go away. People still do math. It's just like a faster way of doing the calculation.
Yeah, but in some ways it seems that we don't need a human creativity in the same way because the computer is doing it. I know artists, for example, are one industry that struggle because everything can be done visually so much. And we talk about the older generations actually struggling with the technology, but I'm sure the younger generations are too. And if you talked to me about your daughter once before.
Yeah, so I have a teenage daughter who would like to be a designer or an artist. So she's taking all those classes that you take as a young person to learn how to draw and to paint and all of those things. I mean, and it's a skill set that you develop over time with a lot of effort put into it. And so I showed her at some point what you can do with something like Midjourney AI, which is just type in a request to create an image and just name the parameters, and it will give you 4 different examples. I mean, are they at this point in time necessarily pieces of art that I would want hanging on my wall? Probably not. But do they work for a book cover or something like that? Absolutely. People use it all the time now for self-publishing books and things like that. So, for someone like her who's in, it just sort of depressed her a little bit to see how quickly AI can spit out a plausible piece of artwork that can be used, especially so when you think about a lot of people who have that urge to be a designer or an artist, they come out and they take jobs doing, working. I mean, sure, they want to do something that's, earth-shattering, but their first few years they're doing things like, doing images for books or for, for whatever. And it's a little depressing to see that some of those things, you may have to work even longer and you're going to be competing against something that does stuff like that.
Yeah, but also sort of, again, just shifting the career into doing it maybe on a computer rather than actually doing it by hand. I know a friend of mine who's an artist who actually decided to incorporate AI into her artwork. So she's got a still, but then she's got the AI version which will move. So she's trying to work with the technology, which is clever and forward thinking, but at the same time, I actually just love it when I can paint, first of all. We all have to adapt. So how have you managed to help your staff adapt with the introduction of AI?
I mean, it's scary for them, right? So they also wonder what happens to my job. Where's this going to go? But again, I think the point is educating them, giving them the opportunity to say, hey, simple tasks may be taken over by AI, but there's a lot of other things that need to be done in order to control AI and be on top of that. And everyone is so many people are talking about AI, but nobody really knows what's going to happen and how to apply it and what does that mean and what are the consequences. Well, that's for us to figure out because I think it's enough theoretical talk. We just need to see what are the opportunities, and I think that's also where we try to get our team, while obviously leaving room for them to voice their concerns and discuss those concerns and discuss downsides and fears and all of those things. It comes back to the acceptance part that I mentioned before. At some point we need to accept that's happening and then get on top of it and move on. And so we try to help them as good as we can in that process.
Yeah, well, as we talked about earlier, this stress, I think, on the body is trying to constantly chase this technology. It really kind of comes into play a lot here. We don't have a medical expert on the table here, but I just want to mention the medical industry and how that's really been affected by AI too. We talked about this toxic molecule, but on the flip side, if we look at some positives, there has been seen AI to sort of really help speed up the research and development with vaccines. We've seen robots doing operations already, which could be very beneficial. So again, pros and cons, it seems like, with everything that we're discussing here today. I'd love to talk a little bit more about the risks, though, and about the threats of all of this technology. Let's come to you, Jannika, first of all, if you want to talk about any of the threats with data protection.
Yeah, certainly. There are risks when we want to project the past into the future, and that we do need to recognize. And I'm sure many of us have heard about algorithmic biases, and the fact that if not done properly, if we are not controlling the outcome and knowing exactly what the input data will look like, we will end up in situations where we enhance racism or exploit sexual orientations and gender biases and religion and all of those things. We do not want to end up there, for one. And then we also, we have seen threats to crime predictions, to recruitment, to insurance, credit, all of those things. That already exists. What I think is a good example is that many of you might know that the EU is passing an AI Act, which is still under negotiation, but there they have listed certain things that are forbidden to do, that the risk to individuals are so high. These are practices that can be done. For instance, there is activities that are subliminal, where individuals are subconsciously manipulated, for instance. There are threats to vulnerable groups and taking advantage of them. There we have the any kinds of social scorings, or when the behavior of individuals are somehow evaluated. And I think the last one is real-time facial recognition. That is also something that we do not want to have. So these are practices just like on the fly that the EU at least say that when it comes to AI, this cannot be done. But of course, there are many threats.
Yeah, well, you just mentioned there about the EU and them taking regulation on the AI. Michael, James, would you like to say something on that?
Yes, I mean, yes, the EU is developing an EU Artificial Intelligence Act, and the aim is to reach an agreement by the end of the year on this law, which, at least from my reading of their position, seems a little optimistic. But it's premised on the idea of having different rules for different risk levels. So they also want to have regulatory sandboxes and real-life environments established by public authorities, which are yet to be created, to test AI before it's being deployed. So as was mentioned, there's an unacceptable risk category, but there are three others. So there's a high-risk category, a limited risk category, and essentially no risk category. The high-risk category is quite interesting. So it's subdivided into two categories. So where you have AI being used in products falling under product safety regulation in the EU, so toys, aviation, cars, medical devices, lifts, those sorts of things. And then you have AI systems falling into 8 very specific categories. And these would need to be registered into an EU database, which is interesting in and of itself. So you have biometric identification and categorization of natural persons, management and operation of critical infrastructure, education and vocational training, employment, worker management and access to self-employment, access to and enjoyment of essential private services, law enforcement, migration, asylum and border control management, and assistance in legal interpretation and the application of the law. And so if the AI covers these topics, then it has to be assessed before it's put onto the market, but also all the time that it's still on the market as well. And as I mentioned, this would need to be registered in an EU-wide database managed by the European Commission. I think that's quite clever. I think that's an awful lot of work to get through, because they also propose to have, essentially premised on how data protection regulation is structured in the EU, to have national AI bodies, essentially, that would also coordinate together with a European-wide one. And that's quite cumbersome, I think. At least in data protection, there are disagreements about the relative weight of the national versus the European data protection board. So I think what they're trying to do is very ambitious, and I think perhaps given some of the risks that have been foreseen or envisaged, is perhaps quite sensible, but I think this is a real challenge to actually implement.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that information. It is great, as you say, to see that they are ambitious with their with their regulations that they're trying to set. I wonder for you and Improove, if you have the EU with such high regulations like that, how is that going to affect all the work that you're doing, having to be so different within one continent?
I mean, the question is, we don't know, and that's exactly the challenge, right? So, let me give you an example. I think part of the regulation is that we have to say when something was created with AI, like content was created with AI. What does that mean? The entire article has been written by AI, and part of it, the research was done. Nobody really knows. You can only be wrong, right? And I think that is the challenge with it. And on top of it, I think it's also for governments really challenging because it's developing as we speak. So once legislation goes through the ranks of government, it's almost outdated because we already moved on. I'm not saying it's not necessary. I appreciate the effort that this is being done, but I think it can only be wrong. And I think the challenge, if one country or the European Union as a group does it, okay, great, but what about the rest of the world? If then different countries have different regulations, or we don't do it here in the U.S., then so what? So I think that is the and if we talked about that before the panel a little bit, and okay, if your product development only waits for the government to be ready, then you're way behind. So what we and a lot of companies do, we just do it, and then we wait for somebody to say no. And is that the right approach? Arguably not, but not moving forward is also enough.
Right. Well, what about Web3? Did you want to add to that?
No, I was just going to add to that, which is I think it's sort of, it's great that the EU is doing this and thinking ahead. The U.S. is not, just like our conversation about technology and privacy. I mean, the U.S. is nowhere close. I mean, the idea that we could get an AI bill with anything that was really worth the time putting into it through our Congress these days it just probably won't happen.
Wasn't there a case actually I read recently of somebody a lawyer who came to court with something written by AI?
Right, and I guess I guess the point of that is that, in terms of risks, there are risks around letting this technology get into places and be used before we know what it's doing, when there's a lot of confusion around what's under the hood. But then there's this flip side of people using it too quickly, and in this case, there was a lawyer in the U.S. who wrote a brief, or had ChatGPT write a full brief that he then submitted to court, and all of the citations in it were wrong. I mean, there was just nothing about the brief that was correct. What's interesting, of course, is if that lawyer had taken his output from GPT and then spent an hour going through it, checking the sites, fixing them, maybe asking some further questions to the AI, you could easily now put together at least a serviceable legal brief using one of the large language models.
That comes down to IP, what you were talking about before, because I believe that article actually mentioned that the ChatGPT used lawyers' names and actually said that they had quoted certain things when they had never done that. Right.
Try ChatGPT sometime and ask it about yourself. Ask what it knows about you. Ask where, and it will get it wrong over and over again. It will think you have a different job, or ask about almost anyone. Once you get to true celebrities and people who have a tremendous amount of information, it gets better. But I do think we sometimes make a mistake right now, though, of looking at these things, these anecdotes about the use of AI, and sort of laughing and saying, well, it's clearly not there yet. You can't use it for these things. But I think we all have to project 5 years out, 10 years out, because it's going to get better and better. And so the idea that a lawyer would use AI to draft a legal brief and submit it to court, I bet in 10 years' time, that's old hat and everyone's doing it.
Yeah.
If you still have courts that are set up the same way, given that maybe there'll
That's
be
true.
AI involved there too.
That might change. Well, what about when we get Web 3? You know, I mean, do we even want a decentralized web?
We don't,
Antíoco, what would you want to say?
we don't know. Like, you know, everything new it has the bad part and the good part of the, you know, always. So of course, Web3 is good because the users are the owners, but who control it? At the end, somebody has to control it. It's gonna be an algorithm controlling something on how content rank and why first and why second. And I don't think the users they will know. So there are a lot of things going around that we need to solve, or they will need to solve before launching this in a proper way. Because at the end, lands know a lot of this, but at the end, in somehow right now the big companies they control internet, and now they want the control by the users. And of course, I don't think there is nothing that is 100% good. So
yeah.
right.
I mean, we talk about the crypto and the blockchain projects that we were talking about earlier. And sorry, Lance, did I interrupt you?
No, I was going to say, I mean, just to, the thing about centralization versus decentralization, I think, is that we always swing between those poles, whether it's in government, whether it's in technology. And so there's going to be periods of time when you get a sort of a more centralized control. And that's why the antitrust laws came about in business, is that you get businesses who get too much power, and then the government comes in and says, well, we're going to have to break those up because it's too much power concentrated in one place. And I think that the sort of technological decentralization represented by blockchain and similar technologies is an effort in some ways to push back against the fact that so much of what's online now is controlled by these centralized companies, but I think it's all ultimately technology is kind of a Swiss Army knife. You're going to use some things for one thing, some things for the other, and so I don't think blockchain or Web3 is the answer. I think it's an answer.
What about all those problems that we alluded to earlier with crypto and blockchain projects? Haven't many of them ended up in the sights of the regulators and the law enforcement?
Yeah, so I've been involved in the space for about 8 years, and there's been anytime you combine an area that has zero regulation and finance, you're going to get a lot of people who are scammers and are trying to make money for nothing. And there has been quite a lot of that in crypto. What's interesting is that the underlying technologies like the Bitcoin blockchain has never been hacked, been running since 2009, and people use it and build on top. It's the things that get built on top. If you don't trust the company building it, and it's not a project that's been decentralized in a way that then it's just another way for a company to build something that's either good or flawed. And there's been a lot of, to your point about building stuff and breaking and seeing about getting caught or regulation coming in. There's been a lot of that in that industry. So I think it's shaking out more and more, and the companies that are good and are well run move more to the top, and you can rely on some of them more and more, but there's still plenty of the bad stuff happening too. So,
but when it comes to blockchain, since it's the technology underpinning Web3, do you not think that there's a way that we can live with it as a benefit rather than as a hindrance? Lance?
I mean, just
kind of alluded to it before.
Yeah, no, it's the same point, is that, if it's it's a technology that is good for certain things. It is good for tracking transactions, whether it's financial, whether it's intellectual property transactions, whether it's real estate, it's really good because what you're at tracking transactions without the need for going to, bank one here and bank two here and looking at their ledgers. It's got this component that's public, and that aspect of it is really useful in certain settings.
I always think it's, like with everything, again, we're coming back to, pros and cons, but it's good that we discuss them and get all of that information out there. I always think it's interesting how the general public kind of really see the pros and cons when it's sort of put out in the media. You know, if we think about, I mentioned before about this molecule, the scientist creating this molecule that I'd seen on this documentary. And there's another documentary I watched. It's called Unknown, if anybody wants to watch it on Netflix. But it's an episode on killer robots, and it's all talking about this company called Shield AI, who are really creating these robots that will go out to war and you know, fire like like our soldiers. So great on the pros, you know, we're saving our soldiers, but on the cons, you know, can these machines make moral decisions in the same way that a human can? I don't believe so. And there was a soldier in this documentary giving this example of how he was at war and a little girl was sent as a spy just to kind of, you know, see what they were doing, and no one's going to shoot the little girl. But the machine wouldn't know that. If that was the machine and not people, the machine would just see them as a threat and fire. And so we're really kind of up against these kind of moral dilemmas when it comes to machines. And I know in previous conversations we were talking about Black Mirror as well.
Yeah.
Do you want to comment on that?
I mean, it's scary and interesting, right, at the same time. And like, there's one part of me thinks, oh wow, interesting, what can be done, and it's not so far away. But the other part, like, wow, to your point of regulation, this should be regulated somehow. And I mean, I don't have a solution to it. I'm just, you know, I get the point of regulation here.
Right. So when we are seeing all of these things, I think it can, you know, put a lot of fear into people, and it's very interesting. It creates a great episode, but as you say, it's like, well, that could really happen. They get that information from somewhere. They know that this is a possibility in the future.
Happened today. You know, like it's very realistic that could happen to any one of us. It's not like far-fetched sci-fi scenarios. It's like very realistic. And I think that's, as much as I'm excited about it, about what it can do, it's also like the balance of it is like, okay, there's a risk associated with it as well. And I mean, to your previous point, like the data is not always correct 100%, but you know, like that's always has been true. It always has been important to fact check data. By the way, there's like an alternative to ChatGPT, which is Google Bard. And the difference is that Google Bard has also very recent information, and ChatGPT, I think, is limited information up until 2021. So there are like additional sources, and I highly encourage everyone to check those sources to at least have more balanced information, and certainly validate the information that you put in there. Like if you just take out whatever the tool gives you and think, oh, that's it, I'm just going to run with it, and you don't do your QA, you're likely to be on the wrong side. So it's kind of twisted answer. So I think, you know, QA and quality control is a responsibility of each one who uses it, companies and organizations, and I guess the government can help with some guidelines.
Yeah, but I don't think people should have access to AI like so freely, you know.
So freely, did you say?
Free, yeah, like, you know, like they should, yeah, the governments or the countries or whoever, they need to control at least the access to AI, because otherwise, you know, they can do whatever they want for bad purposes.
Is this how we can make people feel more safe, do you think, with these kind of regulations, Lance?
So the first question is, do we want to make people feel more safe, or do we want, I mean, so in one way, I think right now is the time we don't want to feel safe about this. We don't want people to look at the government and say, okay, now they're handling it and I'm just going to, I think we want to be watching the use of AI and be really aware of what's happening with it, because it is, you know, government may have some role in restricting it, but I think it's going to be so much of it's already out there, and it will be out there, and it's going to be in so many aspects of your life as a individual. You're going to come across it everywhere. So, you know, right now I think that there are two things. One, we all need to be aware of how we use it, and really push governments and companies to use it to make sure it's being used responsible. But yeah, otherwise I think, sure, I mean, regulation plays a role here. I mean, you don't want AI being sort of set loose in certain areas, in certain fields, because we don't know. What's striking to me is that scientists who are looking at how ChatGPT works don't know fully how it works. Like, and if we don't know how it works, that's something that we need to better understand before you use it in places where there's a risk factor. There's already some risk if it's taking someone's song and using it when it shouldn't. That's a little different than your example of AI, making life or death decision somewhere.
I know I keep coming back to sort of media, but I kind of, knowing that we were doing this panel, was watching a lot of things, and I saw the new Mission Impossible movie, and that is all about how AI gets so intelligent people don't understand it. It takes on its own entity and wants to take over the world. And as you say, it's like, if we don't understand what it's being able to do, how can we in any way control it? And that's the question that comes up in here. Is like, do we want to control it? Do we need to control it? If Web3 is allowing people to not take control, then where do we see ourselves in the future?
I think the history told us that people cannot control.
Yeah.
Because it's going to be under control. I think it's going to be something or that controls something. At the end, it's not. We don't like the fully control, but we don't want the fully uncontrolled. It's got to be something in the middle. Like, if you give the power to the people, in somehow it's going to be.
And then it's a case of keeping up with it because everything's developing so quickly, as we were discussing before. How do we get on top of it before it
the governments is very
control?
slow taking decisions. The technology goes faster than governments and laws.
But that also leaves room for innovation, right? So I think at the end of it, companies are not inherently bad, and I understand that some companies exploit that, and there's the crypto space companies that try to exploit it, but they fail eventually. And is there risk? Yes, there is risk, but in the end, we live on and we move on. And at some point, over-regulating it, especially if it's one government does it and another government does not do it, it just makes one country fall behind. So I think you need to leave a little room there, and I think also train everyone's judgment on what they're getting into and what they're not getting into. You don't have to do certain things.
Well, you mentioned that, but how can countries work together on a global scale for the benefit of mankind? And are there things that we can start doing already today to help this? Jannika?
Well, speaking from a data privacy perspective, I think we first of all need to understand or gain better understanding of what privacy really means. And I have come to understand privacy is working a little bit like freedom and health. We don't really think about it so much until we're being deprived of it. And again, new technology will always bring along new problems. So this is something that we continuously will be chasing. But this is not a single nation's problem. We cannot do this area-wise, or some continents in the world are doing something and some others are doing something else, because we live in a very connected society. We're all connected to tools and services that are international as they are. So I definitely see a need to take a stance on privacy on a global scale. So that's one, what we need for the whole world, basically. When it comes to what companies can do already here today, how I see it when it comes to privacy and data protection questions is a company treat them as legal problems. And that is why most privacy professionals are lawyers, because it's a legal compliance problem. But if we start to expand that into not seeing it necessarily as only a legal problem, but also as a technological problem, a tech problem and an organizational problem, essentially, we can also find other competences to kind of solve this together, because this is nothing that lawyers, as great as we are, can solve by ourselves. So that is one.
What other developments are we expecting to see then with data privacy and data security? Michael, James, do you want to allude to that?
Well, not specifically to do with data protection, but there are two new, quite hefty legislative packages in the EU that have entered into force, and they will take effect next year. And they're the so-called Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act. And together, they're intended to create a safer digital space in which essentially the fundamental rights, as understood by the Charter, are protect all users, and they're also to establish a level playing field to theoretically foster innovation, growth, and competitiveness, both in the single market and globally. And I mean, these are weighty pieces of legislation. So just to take the Digital Markets Act for an example. So that identifies what it calls as gatekeepers, which are large digital platforms performing what it calls core platform services, so online search engines, app stores, messenger services. And these gatekeepers are to be subject to a series of obligations and prohibitions. And just to underline what sort of companies we're talking about, the companies have to notify the European Commission if they think they are likely to be within the concept of a gatekeeper. And the Commission has already received notifications from Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, ByteDance, Meta, Microsoft, and Samsung. So that was by April of this year. And the idea is to both, it's a bit of a hybrid, really. So it's taking competition law, so antitrust law, and combining it with fundamental rights protection, and then applying it in the digital space, which is a bit convoluted, but anyway. So the idea is that there are certain obligations, so third parties must be able to interoperate with the gatekeeper's own services, and business users must have access to the generated in these gatekeepers' platforms, and so on. But gatekeepers are also prohibited from certain things. So, for example, they're not allowed to treat their own products more favorably in how they set up rankings than anyone else. They can't fix the results, essentially. And they can't prevent, which I think is quite good for most people, users from uninstalling any pre-installed software or app on their device that if they wish to do so. There are also hefty fines with this. So this is another aspect that comes from competition law and from data protection law. So you can have fines of up to 10% of the worldwide annual turnover for the company. Or if there's an event of a repeated infringement, that goes up to 20%. I mean, this is a lot of money. And just for fun, they also have periodic penalty payments of up to 5% of annual daily turnover. So that is serious.
Definitely is. Thank you for all that information. Great insights there. I do want to come to our audience if anybody's got any questions and see if you've got any comments for the panel as well. Happy to have you contribute to the conversation. Just lastly, though, anything else that you would like to add, Jannika, in terms of developments of data protection?
I guess it all comes down to not seeing our own privacy as a secondary value, because it's so easy to down prioritize it when something else comes along, profit or other values. But to actually more and more really consider the benefits of actually having our own privacy, because it's not gonna get better from here. So not gonna be all doomsday about it.
Yeah,
on that happy note.
Yeah, exactly. On that happy note, it's about the future should be positive. But then you look at I'm going to keep referencing movies, but I think about Steven Spielberg's Ready Player One, where everybody's living within this virtual world in the future, and that's kind of a scary thought, really. Do you think that that's going to be our future, Michael? No, good.
I don't think so. I think also on a happy note, I think there's a lot of positive aspects to it. I mean, I think we're not going to live in a virtual world, because if we did, we wouldn't be here, right? You could easily do that over video conference. We don't.
Yeah.
And there's experiences to it. Like when you go somewhere, it's more than just I'm in New York right now, so it's the flavor of it. Or you travel wherever you go, and there's experiences associated with it. So live a little in that part as well. But yes, use technology where it's useful, right? So if we didn't have Zoom and such technologies, it would have made our lives a lot easier. Not as easy as it is.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of good things to it, but also live a little. And
live a little. Great takeaway. I like that.
And an additional note, I think we're on a positive outlook of it as well, is see, on our team, there's tasks. You copy things from one sheet to another, and it's just been done that way because we didn't have the technology to do it otherwise. Now we have technology to do it, so fantastic. We can use human creativity, intelligence, all of it for other tasks that are more demanding, more exciting. So it's a good thing. We don't have to do the repetitive tasks, we can do the fun tasks. So if you look at it that way, I think there's a lot of opportunities there, while I understand all the scenarios of risk out there.
Yeah, well, it's changing, as we said, and we have to adapt to all of these changes. Do we have any questions from anybody here?
Sure.
Yes, go ahead.
So the theme for today is that how rapidly technology, particularly AI, is changing right now. The regulatory frameworks and businesses are struggling to keep up. Common criticism of the legal profession is that it too can be overly conservative at times and slow to adapt. So my question is, what advice would you have for us to bring into our own practices day to day to be change agents and to help move this process along? And I would give an example, maybe more example, with the impact COVID has had on a lot of legal practice. So we had things like digital notary, or we had video conferencing, or change to mail requirements, and so on and so on. Obviously, we can't manufacture a pandemic to adopt AI. So that's
Do you want somebody in particular to answer, or is it open to anyone? Who would like to answer?
I can start. So, I think it's a great question. I mean, what's interesting to me about law is that, about the practice of law, is that you work for clients who their technologies and their business is changing all the time. So we are, as lawyers, we are used to that. So having a client come and say, hey, look, I'm now going to be using this technology for this purpose. Is that okay? And we're really comfortable figuring that stuff out because we're applying existing laws. We're using our same structures at our law firm to, okay, have the associate look this up and then have the paralegal check it and then put together a memo and it's going to go out to the client. So in that way, we embrace change as lawyers. But in terms of the practice of law, other than sort of in the e-discovery practice and sort of legal searching like Westlaw and Lexis, the use of technology has not really been as extensive as it should. I do think it's been changing. I think the pandemic accelerated it. I think that we are going to get a lot of lawyers, if they're not careful, are going to be out of work if they don't figure it out now, because there is going to be the changes that are coming in the way lawyers can do work and what lawyers are needed for. To your point of like those rote tasks, there are a lot of rote tasks in the law. There's a lot of contract, drafting, and that's just, I'm going to cut and paste this here, I'm going to do that there. Those jobs are not going to be around. And as lawyers, how do you fill your plate with, if all of a sudden everything gets more and more efficient and you're billing by the hour? I mean, it's not as easy if you turn to an AI and say, draft this brief. You don't go to an associate to do that. An AI drafts something. It's not great right now. In 10 years, it may be perfect. What does that mean? So, I mean, the only advice is change is constant now. And so if you're going to be, you need to be, as a lawyer or as a law firm, you need to be thinking that way all the time. And you need to incorporate it as quickly as you can, even though as lawyers we're going to be careful about how we do it. You can't bury your head in the sand and think it's not coming. And I think that it's difficult. That acceleration of change makes it hard. But I think asking that question is the right step, because there are far too many lawyers out there not asking that question. So it's that's the key thing, is to be looking at it and figuring it out as we go.
Michael, James, Jannika, any other further advice?
Just adding to what Lars was saying, I'm also really looking forward to some of the mundane, very repetitive tasks that we are doing, to be honest, that could be replaced. There are, of course, some risks to this, and the confidentiality aspects and all of that to it. I have used tools for reviews of agreements, and not drafting agreements, but reviewing them, and that makes that process a whole lot faster. So that benefit does exist. I do think there will be an interplay between man and machine. So I don't think one is going away anytime soon, but it will be a different way of approaching things, and I'm honestly looking forward to it.
You're not, did you say?
I am.
You are?
I am.
Okay.
Yes, I'd add something focused more about a perspective from the other side of the bar. So there may well be change foisted upon the legal profession from the judiciary. And so something I found particularly interesting was a speech given a month ago by Sir Geoffrey Voss, who's the Master of the Rolls in England and Wales. So that's the second most important judge in England and Wales. And he gave a speech to the Law Society of Scotland talking about the positives of AI and its introduction into a digital judicial system. And he was talking about the digital justice system that's being introduced into England and Wales to provide an appropriate online pre-action portal or dispute resolution forum. Now, there is something slightly similar under an EU directive from 2016, I think. But the idea is that this digital system, justice system, would culminate ultimately as what he regarded as a funnel in the online court process that's already being developed. And he thinks that AI will be used within this digital justice system in the kind that's being created in England and Wales. And he thinks that at some stage that AI will start taking at first very minor decisions. And he thinks that the limiting feature for machine-made decisions is likely to be the requirement that the citizens and businesses that any justice system serves have confidence in that system. So there are certain systems which certain topics for judicial decisions that he thinks would be specifically excluded. So I think there will be pressure both from individual practitioners to be more efficient for their clients, but also from the other side for the justice system saying, well, we've got these systems, you're being replaced, you've got to adapt.
Thank
and
you
survive.
very much. Is there another question?
I mean, I can add something.
Oh, yeah,
From
go ahead.
a client
Go ahead,
perspective, so
Michael.
one thing you
Yeah.
can take home, I guess, is like I think for me the difference between a great and a good attorney is if they also try to understand what I'm doing here, right? So if the experience I had at least, like okay, the attorneys read the letter of the law to me, and then okay, I cannot develop a product around that. It's more distracting, right? But if they try to understand what I'm doing and understand the product, we had the conversation yesterday, try to understand the technology and find ways to work with me, I'd love to have them on board in product development. So understanding that the technology is changing and what we're trying to accomplish. So not just, here's the law, that's it, you need to build your product around it because that's likely not going to happen, but like work side by side.
Great answer. Anybody else? A quick final question before we close out today? No? Okay. Well, unless anybody else has got something else that they're dying to add that we feel like we missed out, I'll close out the session here this afternoon. But I want to say a huge thank you for all of your insights. It's been very interesting and also a little scary, to talk about all the technology and the future of what's to come. So I'd like to thank all of the audience for staying with us as well here this afternoon, and I'd like to ask you all to give a round of applause to our panel. Antíoco, Cuesta, Jannika, Törnqvist, Michael Schwarz, Kuonce, and Michael James-Clifton. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and thanks again for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.